The local news industry has seen better days. The last 15 years or so have been pockmarked with mass layoffs, shuttered newspapers, and growing news deserts. But there have been bright spots in the local news landscape, lean media startups that aim to fill the gaps left by their legacy newspaper counterparts. One such startup is called CityCast. Founded by former Slate editor David Plotz, CityCast has a unique model in which it simultaneously launches both a daily newsletter and podcast in each city it covers. For today's episode, I spoke to Bryan Vance, CityCast's director of newsletters. We discussed the company's playbook for launching in new cities, how it creates synergies between its podcasts and newsletters, and its approach to gathering local news. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, on to my interview with Bryan. Hey Bryan, thanks for joining us.
Hey Simon, thank you for having me.
So you're the director of newsletters of a company called CityCast. Can we first start with you telling us what CityCast is?
Yeah, so CityCast is a newer company. We are a network of daily local podcasts and newsletters in cities across the country. So, trying to think of think of us as like a mini newsroom in cities across the country where we're dedicated to two products, newsletters and podcasts.
Yeah, and it was founded by David Plotz, who, was an editor-in-chief when Slate was of Slate, when it was like early pioneer in podcasting. He still hosts a very popular politics podcast for Slate.
Yes.
And he's become somewhat of an entrepreneur in recent years. He was at, what was the travel?
Atlas Obscura.
Atlas Obscura for several years as the CEO, and he's the founder of CityCast. And the whole idea is that, as you said, it's taking a local podcast and pairing it with a local newsletter and trying to see if there are synergies between those two things. How many cities is it in?
We are in 11 as of last week. It's technically 10 and a half, which I can explain in more detail later, but yeah, so 11 cities, a mix of, pretty large markets like Chicago and Houston, and then smaller markets like Boise and Madison.
Yeah, and I'm a subscriber to the DC one and have been since the start, so I've gotten a sense of what you guys are publishing. So there are lots of companies centered around city-based newsletters. Axios has launched a bunch, 6 a.m. City, Whereby Us. But this is the first one that I know of that also pairs each newsletter with the podcast. Like, what's the kind of philosophy for why these two mediums have synergy with each other?
Well, what really stood out about both of these platforms is they have distinct ways of facilitating and establishing connections with an audience. So a podcast, you can get a real clear emotional connection with the host. It often feels like the host is talking to you, like you're having a dialogue with them, even though you're not actually talking back to them. And then newsletters, it feels like if a newsletter is done well, it feels like someone is writing directly to you. And with a newsletter, you can write back. You can easily get involved in the conversation. And so that's what really, struck a chord with CityCast, is that these were both platforms that people are hyper engaged with. Someone who listens to podcasts tends to listen to a lot of podcasts, and someone who subscribes to newsletters tends to listen to a lot of newsletters, and they're really good at facilitating connection and community.
They also strike me like as two mediums where it's easy to build habits around. Like you think of the podcast, sitting on the metro or the subway, listening to a daily news podcast just to get updated on that day's events. Same thing with a newsletter. When you get into your office or whatever, fire up your computer, the first thing you might do is check your email and kind of you'll have like an entire bunch of newsletters that are kind of keeping you updated on that day's news. So it's like hitting people at maybe two different parts of their morning, right? Their commute and maybe
exactly
the first thing they do when they're getting to their desks.
And we understand that not everyone's going to consume both those products. So you may be more of a podcast person. I may be more of a newsletter person. That way we're able to cover a wider swath of audience in these cities. But our hope is that you'll dabble in the newsletter and I'll dabble in the podcast. And we are seeing some success with that, with people, checking in on those products. So.
Yeah, and a lot of companies now have hybrid work from home policies. So maybe on a day you're working from home, you're reading the newsletter. On a day you're commuting, you're listening to the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So I know
that way you can kind of tailor it to your own habits and your own schedule. So
yeah. So I know that like I've kind of been paying attention to like the local newspaper space, and I know that like newspapers have dabbled in podcast here or there, but as far as I know, there's nobody trying to scale up a local podcast network. My sense is that like there's just like the podcasting is very, even though it's been around for 15 plus years, like at the local level, local advertisers are, aren't really well educated on podcast advertising. They're always kind of behind the curve. But is the feeling there that like that it's reaching enough kind of mainstream adoption with advertisers that the timing is right in terms of introducing like a podcast network at the local level, I guess?
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of it. And one of the reasons why we are forming a network is to help facilitate the creation of a local podcasting ad network. So the fact that we are in 11 markets means that a national advertiser could easily buy local podcasting ads in 11 cities and more as we grow. So that's absolutely a part of it. I think we've also just seen that no one's doing this. Like no one has actually tried this. There has been some efforts, various efforts at like Gannett at one point was to, trying to roll out like a season in different cities. That didn't work out. And so we saw this as a huge opportunity for us to be like the first in like a local podcasting network to carve out that niche.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the like appealing to national advertisers by having such a large network. I actually tweeted this morning a note that I've been, following Axios DC since the very beginning, and I haven't seen a single local advertiser on there, and it's all been national advertisers. So, a lot of people responded to that tweet saying, well, this is probably Axios's like ambition or their strategy is like, because they have a national network, then they can still appeal to national advertisers, which are a little bit more sophisticated and willing to buy ads than local businesses at this point. So it opens up two avenues of advertising.
Yeah, and I mean that's definitely like we want to attract national advertisers. At the same time, we don't want to exclude local advertisers, and specifically on the newsletter side, we've seen a lot of success with appealing to local advertisers. Our DC newsletter is running ads consistently from a local car care company, and we've seen a lot of success in Denver, for example, with running ads for local arts and culture facilities and entities. So we're trying to show that we have a wide variety of ad offerings that can scale up to a big national advertiser, but then can also allow smaller players in a local market to get in on what we're doing.
So what's your background in newsletters? How did you build the expertise that made you right for this job?
So I am a journalist by training, a digital journalist. I worked at Oregon Public Broadcasting for a long time as sort of a jack of all trades, digital, multimedia journalist. We knew we wanted to start a newsletter when I was there. No one knew how to do it, and no one was interested in doing it. So I stepped up and dove into that. And created OPB's now 6-day-a-week daily newsletter, ran that for several years, and then, sort of branched out from there. I spent a year working for a national environmental nonprofit running all of their email communications, but I am a journalist by trade, and I wanted to get back into that. And so the mix of running something daily that was segmented to a wide geographic region, so OPB covers all of Oregon and part of Southwest Washington, a daily newsletter that you send out to that big of an area, it can't include the same thing for every subscriber, so we were doing some cool segmentation stuff there. And then also running a national email, department for a big nonprofit, I think provided me the right mix of skills to kind of merge those two things together into a national network of daily local newsletters.
And like at the public radio, so that is kind of like a pairing of newsletter with audio. What kind of synergies did you notice? What kind of like response did you get from the people who normally listen to the audience? Did you find new audience, or was it the already existing audience for the radio?
We did a little bit. I will say, and I think this shouldn't come as a shock to anyone who's ever worked in public media. The way public media operates can be very stagnant. It can be really hard to change things, and there might be ideas that come from the top down that it's really hard to change them. So there were some ideas around show promotion that we tried. So, promoting what would be on Morning Edition at 8 o'clock. That didn't work. It was very clear, no matter how we packaged it, that was not what people were opening the newsletter looking for. What we did find success with was pulling out basically like a curated edition of our daily talk show or a really interesting podcast episode from one of our other shows and highlighting why you might want to break your normal routine and listen to this. We saw a lot of success with that, of pointing people to, individual episodes of our daily talk show, Think Out Loud. We'd see spikes in listenership if we did it really well. And then we did something really cool at one point. We launched a investigative narrative podcast called Timber Wars. Totally new, we're trying to build an audience from scratch, and we built a companion course newsletter that ran with it so that we could rope people in who might be more interested in the newsletter side. We were able to repurpose all the reporting that was done for the podcast and add some additional stuff, but basically create a sister product for people who may not be into podcasts. But we did see a lot of crossover. We saw people who came in via the newsletter and then found the podcast that we were basing it off of and started subscribing to it that way. So, nothing, there's no magic bullet. There's no do this and you will see X. It's a lot of experimentation, but I did see that there is appetite for discovering, really great audio content via email.
And so how did you get the job at CityCast? So was it a cold email to Dave Plotz? Did you see a job posting?
Yeah, there was a job posting. It was actually one of our city editors, the editor for Hey Chicago, our newsletter in Chicago, Sydney Madden. Her and I are members of a community of digitally focused, audience engagement focused journalists, and she posted something about CityCast was looking for someone to head up their newsletter strategy. So I applied, the traditional way through a job application and everything. But it was, I remember reading David's initial post that he did back in 2020 about his vision for CityCast and what it was, and being really interested in that. So I had kept my eye on CityCast the whole time, but it took seeing a job posting to realize that there was actually a space for me here. So. And
when did you start there?
April of this year, so April of 2022. So, haven't been here a year yet, but it's been a whirlwind of 8 months or so.
So walk me through the playbook of launching a new CityCast newsletter in a new city. Obviously, all probably is paired with launching a podcast. I seem to remember the newsletter in DC launch first and then the podcast later. So who do you have to hire? What are the things that have to be in place in order to get a newsletter up and running in a new city?
Yeah, so each of our teams starts with what we call a lead producer. You can think of him as the editor of that small CityCast team. So we hire that person, and then they help shape the vision of the team that will produce the podcast and newsletter. So they help come up with the logo, the theme music, the tone that we want to take in the newsletter, and then we hire out those people. So that can take a few months. Sometimes it's really fast and we can get it done in a month. Sometimes it can take 3 months. Hiring is just a complex system. Once we get everyone in place, we actually move pretty quickly. We spend about a month doing what we call piloting, where we build episodes and newsletters that won't necessarily go out to the public, but that by all intents and purposes are meant to look and feel like that, so we can really nail down the content and the workflow. And then once we're done with piloting, we go live with the newsletter. The newsletter goes live at 5 days a week right from the start. The podcast goes live at 2 days a week from the start. Just because a podcast, there's a lot of technical stuff that goes along with it, so it's better to slowly ramp that up. And then they from then they're working daily to produce this content and get it out the door.
So you got the lead producer at the top who's overseeing both the newsletter and podcast. Who's staffed specifically just on the newsletter?
So it does vary a little bit, but we've settled on a general model of so each city team will have a lead producer, a podcast host, a newsletter editor, which you can think of as the newsletter host, and then a producer who primarily is focused on the podcast, but is also cross-trained to help out the newsletter and produce things for that platform as well.
And so to walk us through the format of the typical newsletter, what kind of stuff you're putting in these newsletters, like what's kind of the formula for that?
Yeah, so we want to, what we've seen where we can stand out versus the competition is like not lean all in on any one thing. So not lean all in on hard news and not lean all in on lifestyle. We try to offer like a nice mix of all of the above. So each newsletter starts off with a quick hit look at the local news, and we don't shy away from any type of news, the good, the bad, the ugly. We share it all. And then we transition into what we call recurring segments, which are sort of our bread and butter. They're the life hacks, the explainers about how to get things done in the city, the audience engagement components. Like we run scavenger hunts in all of our cities, and so we'll feature typically 2 recurring segments a day. We always include a roundup of events, and we crucially make sure to point out where those events are happening, because nothing's more frustrating than seeing an event that you're interested in and then clicking on the link and realizing it's like 45 minutes away from you and it'll be rush hour when it's happening. So we do that. We always include podcast promotion too. So let people know what's on the episode that day. And that's basically a Hey City newsletter in a nutshell.
And is there, like, are you hiring, like, seasoned journalists? Are they doing any original reporting? Are they picking up the phone?
Yeah, so in terms of who we've hired, it's been a mix. We definitely have some, like, newer people who this is, one of their first jobs out of college. We also have some people who have been working as daily reporters at newspapers for decades. And it's a mix of aggregation and original reporting. So they are doing, traditional aggregation, looking out and seeing what's happening in the news ecosystem and pulling out the most interesting or important stories. But they're also, picking up the phone, calling local officials, calling, experts to get explanations and to get some additional context about what's happening. A great example of how we've done this is in Portland, where our newsletter editor there, Rachel Monahan, who is a seasoned journalist, she came over from the bigger of the 2 alt weeklies we have in Portland. She's always, every single week, she is reporting something new out in the newsletter. She's calling up a politician or some sort of expert in the environment or weather to explain something that's happening. And I think it really adds a nice touch to these newsletters, because it's not just repackaging. There is something unique. There is something additive there that you wouldn't get elsewhere.
And you mentioned you do a little bit of crowdsourcing. I've noticed this with the DC newsletter. Like you'll post some kind of photo, but it won't identify where the photo is, and it'll be somewhere in the city, and then you'll solicit. What other kinds of stuff are you crowdsourcing? Yeah,
so we do that. We we do more general audience engagement things, like getting story ideas from people, getting them to weigh in on spicy topics. So if we've ran something recently and we want to kind of hear what people have to say about it, we'll do that. We have a segment in most of our cities that we call Chatter, which is just like, featuring what people are writing into the show in the newsletter about, what people are saying on social media. So we'll often spark conversations around a specific topic there. When we round up like lists of places to check out, so say we want to look at the best coffee shops in DC, well, that's not an objective label. So what we do is we ask the audience to help us pick those. Like, what are the ones that we absolutely need to highlight? And we've seen, a good rate of response for all those different types of audience engagement. We're constantly thinking of different ways to try new things out. That scavenger hunt that you were talking about, where we typically share a photo of something out in the physical world. We're going to try to explore some ways to integrate audio into that, to maybe get people to hear a sound and tell us where it came from. But we're seeing a good healthy response rate to all these things that we try.
And how are you finding an audience? Like, I seem to remember seeing some Instagram ads for the DC newsletter, so I guess there's probably some paid spend there. But given that you're doing a lot of curation that's hard to get to, get shared on social media and stuff like that versus original reporting, how are you thinking around growing an audience?
Yeah, so to this point, we have primarily focused on paid social ads, so Facebook, Instagram, to a lesser extent Twitter. We are running or getting ready to run Google ads in all of our markets. We are rebuilding our website so that we can create more content. Not necessarily create more content, because we're creating the stories already, but package it in a way that can aid discoverability, so more organic search discoverability. And we're also getting out. We're hosting events. We just did an event in Salt Lake City where we rounded up a bunch of people at a bar and introduced them to the show and the newsletter. So we're trying a few different things. And then cross promotion. We do know that these audiences are different. So people who have signed up for the podcast haven't necessarily checked out the newsletter. So we're trying to entice them over, through house ads and curated calls to action.
For the live events, is that a revenue driver right now, or is that mainly just kind of like a marketing, get to know the audience?
It's a marketing thing to this point. It is something we have on the radar in the future as we grow out our revenue models. But for now, we're using it primarily as like a marketing tool, just to help drive awareness and get people excited about the show and the newsletter.
So you mentioned cross promotions between a newsletter and podcast. Are there any other synergies that are going on? Like, is there any kind of like coordinating in terms of what's being covered in the newsletter versus the podcast, and how do we work together to amplify some piece of content, or you know what I'm saying? Like maybe using the newsletter as a script when doing different stuff like that.
Yeah, so it's obviously evolved, and we've been able to tailor it based on what we're seeing from the audience. And what we've settled on, at least for now, is that they are complementary but not repetitive. So I will use Portland as an example. That our show just launched in Portland last week with an interview with a local rock legend, and she was sort of reliving the glory days. And then the next day in the newsletter, we ran a segment on historical Portland rock venues that she helped us come up with, but you didn't hear that in the podcast. It's additive. It served as a way for anyone who signs up to both. You got a little bit of a bonus, but if you don't listen to the podcast and you see the newsletter, you still get something out of that hard work we did in securing that guest, and maybe it entices you to click through and listen. So we're doing things like that. We'll collaborate. Our Chicago team did a summer bucket list challenge where they picked a bunch of things that you should do in Chicago before summer ends and created this like interactive game out of it. And through both the newsletter and podcast, they were able to promote it and celebrate people who were crossing the most things off. We do some just general coordination in that, like, if we know we're going to be covering this topic on the podcast, we're going to plan to cover something similar or additive in the newsletter, and vice versa, to make sure that we're giving people the fullest picture possible.
And what is your, as the director of newsletters, like, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis overseeing all this? Justify your employment right now.
Yeah, I am the chief motivator of our newsletter editors. Like that's my primary role as I see it, is I am trying to keep them excited and fired up about doing their job, about executing the strategy. I definitely spend a lot of my time thinking through the strategy, like laying out our content framework. That general model I walked you through earlier, that was one of my first big initiatives at CityCast, was defining that. It was sort of we were doing a different thing every single day, and so I was putting some structure around that. And then really digesting the data, diving into the metrics and seeing what is actually happening with the audience, because you can hear one thing from readers and then you can see something else. And so taking a look at that and making micro adjustments to the strategy in each city, because these cities are different, and something that works really well in DC may not work as well in Boise. And so how do we pivot it to make it more effective in Boise, but still keep it on brand and on mission with CityCast? That's sort of what I'm thinking about every day.
But I'm guessing the exact opposite is true also, in the sense that, like, if someone in Boise does something experimental that works really well, then you could like roll that out to the entire network.
Absolutely.
And see if it works with them.
And Boise's actually a great example. I was talking about the audio stuff. Like that's an idea that came out of the Boise team with their newsletter, trying out different types of scavenger hunts. So not just sharing photos of places, but maybe sharing sounds of places. And so that's something we want to explore more of.
Mm-hmm. And have you, other than that, if there's been anything like, I mean, I think of my own newsletter and how much it's changed over the last 2 years in terms of format and what I'm delivering. Have there been any kind of like major changes that you've rolled out to where you thought something would work, but really it was this other thing that was really successful?
Oh yeah, I mean, we were doing a lot of like true like big features to start off the newsletter. When I got here, most of our newsletters were starting every day off with like a pretty lengthy, 300 to 400 word original piece. We thought that was, something that was going to really help us stand out against the competition. When we polled our audience, we found out that actually wasn't what they were most interested in. What they really wanted first was a highlight of the news. So we quickly pivoted and rearranged the structure of our newsletter to do that. And then they wanted a mix of like, more hard news things, like what's going on with the Portland charter reform, but also just like practical life tips. Like this is an explainer we ran in Houston that it sounds really wonky and nerdy, but it was just really well executed and we got a lot of good feedback about it. How do you renew your license at the DMV? Like during the pandemic, everything has changed. Do you still need to stand in line and take time off work to get your license updated? Turns out, no, there are creative ways you can do that. So we've tried things like that. And then we do see things that started in one city that worked really well that we run everywhere. One of our recurring segments that we do at CityCast, we call Urban Almanac, and it's basically a mini feature on something in the environmental world of your city. So, a lot of our news is focused on people and on places, but this is a segment where we will actually talk about a plant or an animal that you can only find, or that you maybe not only find, but you will find in your community, and just kind of pull the curtain back and tell you a little bit more about that. That started in Houston. That was just a random idea our Houston newsletter editor had, because Houston is such a geographically diverse city, and because people don't necessarily get out to different parts of the city because it is so huge. She had this idea of highlighting, just different animals and plants and insects and whatnot. And it's taken off. It's been one of our most successful recurring features. It's something that the audience really looks forward to. And we've done some really, really cool things with it too. And just, exposing people to parts of their community that they may have overlooked. You may walk past that tree every single day, but you didn't really realize that it has a fascinating backstory in your community.
So I've interviewed both the head of, I think, 6 a.m. City and Where By Us. I can't remember which of these two did this, but they were increasingly relying on crowdsourcing for news tips. Like they were training their audience to, if they were walking by a business that was closing, or the announcement of a new business that was opening, or something else, they would they would send. They were trained to start like either tagging them on social media or actually writing into a tip line. I don't know how well aware you are of the DC market, but there's a blog here called Prince of Petworth, also known as Popville, and he's gotten really excellent in terms of crowdsourcing. And anytime there's like cop activity or any kind of ruckus going on, you'll see a bunch of tweets where they're all of a sudden tagging him on Twitter, and then he starts retweeting them, and it starts like creating like kind of like this crowdsourced reporting on what's going on. It's happened a lot with like crime and stuff like that. Are you trying to facilitate that sort of news tips, crowdsourcing, stuff like that?
We're doing it less so on the hard news side of it, though. Like where we've seen the initial success with it and getting, I would say, a more diverse pool of people to respond is in getting them to like let us know about just like goings on in neighborhoods. So we run weekly neighborhood guides, and we've had a lot of people write in to let us know about this cool new place that opened up, or this business that's closing and going through a hard time, or just giving us the inside scoop on something in that neighborhood that we may not have been able to figure out on our own, but because they live there and are in that neighborhood every day. So we're training people to get into that model of like letting us know about things with those features first, but we have had people write in and let us know about bigger issues that are going on. I can't think of an example off the top of my head right now, but I do remember of something. Oh, this is something that happened in Chicago. Someone wrote in to let us know how difficult it is in a city that has an ungodly amount of vacant lots, how difficult it is to actually acquire one of those from the city for the purpose of building a home on it. It's a years long process. And in a city that, has an issue with housing affordability and homelessness, that's frustrating. And I don't think that was something most people were aware of. So, someone wrote into the show with that. They were able to do a whole episode on it. And it's a show that people keep pointing back to on social media. We see people share it around often.
So I know that you're primarily on the editorial side, but what can you tell us about the business side of CityCast? I'm assuming that it's primarily advertising supported.
To this point, yeah, we're primarily advertising supported. Our big goal for 2023 is to really ramp up our revenue. So we're hiring a vice president of revenue who will oversee all those efforts, and to, diversify those revenue streams. So absolutely keep growing the ad sector of it, but we know that a healthy business needs to have multiple pools of money coming in. So we want to start exploring some of those other opportunities. We have ideas for a membership offering. Not 100% sure yet if that will be on the docket for 2023, but events we know are a great driver of revenue and something that we think we could do really well and in a way that others haven't done, specifically because of our podcasting component. And merch. Like we are owned by a holding company who owns several businesses, including a company that can make merchandise. So we're exploring what that would look like to offer local curated shops in each of our cities to help people get things that celebrate the community that they're a part of.
You're owned by Graham Holdings.
Yeah, Graham Holdings. So it used to be the Washington Post company before they sold the Washington Post to Jeff Bezos. They own Slate. They own Kaplan. They own a bunch of different things. They're very diversified. And CityCast is a part of the Graham Holdings family.
And like the advertising that you do offer, it's primarily native advertising. Like you're not running like programmatic banner ads or anything like that.
Well, we have started on the podcasting side running programmatic ads. Yeah. So, if you're listening on Spotify, you might get different ads than if you're listening on Pocket Cast, for example. And we've seen some early successes with that. We are still running native ads, though, in all of our podcasts, so it's a mix. I don't think we would ever go all one direction. It's not scalable to offer 3 to 4 ads a day if it's all host reads, and it's probably not as dynamic if it's all programmatic. And then on the newsletter, it is all native at this point, but we are exploring options to allow us to do a little bit more automation on that side of things.
Well, yeah, because it's not self-service. They still need to go through some kind of representative.
They go through us,
yeah. And you don't hire ad salespeople in each of the individual cities. Like you have.
Are. Yes, that's one of the ways that we think we can make this really sustainable. Is the core support teams are centralized, and when I say centralized, I mean like they answer up to headquarters. We are a full remote company, so it's not like they're all in DC or all in Chicago or whatnot. But so we have like a marketing team versus having someone who works on marketing for each city. We have a team that they're experts in this and they can apply strategic options to each city. And we're doing the same thing on the ad side. We have an ad operations coordinator who oversees all of our ad offerings and is handling all those incoming ads. And we're going to hire more people for that team once we get this VP in to really build out those muscles and just offer more support to each of our cities.
Yeah, but I mean, I see a lot of companies like this where they have some centralized ad thing, even though they're doing local stuff. I have to wonder, though, I got started in local newspapers, and I remember our ad people, they were knocking on doors, going into businesses, making phone calls. They were a part of the community, and that gave them, a little bit of, advantage in terms of selling local ads. And I think we spoke earlier in this podcast about how a lot of these local newsletters are selling mainly national ads. I wonder if there's any kind of weakness there, because just DC alone, that's got to be there's a ton of local businesses there.
There's a ton.
It could support a commission-based, local ad person. I don't know. It's just my thoughts in terms of how do you entice local advertisers if you don't have someone on the ground, networking with that community.
And that's something that I think where we can actually kind of leverage our local teams to assist in that. Maybe they wouldn't own the entire experience because they aren't ad people, but we have already seen them build connections. In Salt Lake, for example, that team has built connections with local business owners through just being out and about, and they've reached out to CityCast then about running ads because they've had a positive connection with the people who are making the audio and the newsletter that they love and that they see that the community is engaging with, and then we're able to kind of facilitate a conversation internally with other people at CityCast about getting them, some ads on our network. So I think it'll wind up being some sort of hybrid offering, of like maybe not a dedicated person in every city, but people who can still serve that role in some capacity.
Yeah, I'm being a little unfair for pressing you on this since you don't work on the advertising side, so I'm putting you in the spotlight. But just one last question about that. Of the ads that you see running into the newsletters you run, are they primarily national, or do you see a lot of local ads coming through?
No, actually, they've mostly been local, which I think is super cool because we're seeing just some really neat ads. We have started to get a few national ones, but I would say by and large they're still very local. Like you're getting automotive businesses in DC, you're getting the art museum in Denver. It's been local people on the ground reaching out and advertising in our newsletters, so that's been super exciting to see.
So a lot of the buzzy local newsletter startups, I've already name checked several of them, they've all been centered around cities. What about the suburbs or rural areas? Like, could you ever see CityCast like having a viable business model where it's moving into the suburbs or slightly less densely populated regions?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's potential there, and we're already starting to play around with how do we broaden our coverage pool in some of our cities because of feedback we've heard from the audience where they're saying, hey, it's great that you focus on the true downtown core, but what about us who are 20 minutes outside city borders? We still identify as being in Boise, even though our address may not be Boise. And so we're figuring out ways to expand our coverage pool without having to do more work. It's about how to work more efficiently. We have plans to expand more in 2023. We don't know yet where we want to go, but that's absolutely something we're considering is how do we cover a more diverse geographic region. And we particularly don't want this to be seen as only a liberal, urban, hip news outlet. Cities aren't all liberals. Cities aren't all, urban people. You still have farmers in city limits in a lot of our cities. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're creating something that can offer value to as many people as possible.
Another thing when I talk to the heads of these buzzy local newsletter startups is a lot of them say we will never have more than 2 editors in a city. We find that model works. If we ever have any excess capital or profits that we want to invest in expansion, we're just going to launch in a new city. That's how we're going to expand. What are your thoughts on, obviously you're very curation focused, a little bit of original reporting, but mostly curation. Could you ever see 10 years from now, hiring 10, 12 reporters in one city and giving them beats and stuff like that and really kind of expanding within the original reporting side? Or do you think you will always be kind of a very lean curation focused newsletter operation?
I definitely think we'll always be lean, but I do think that there is an avenue in the future where we're still a little bit bigger, where maybe lean is a 6-person team or a 7-person team instead of a 4. We're definitely not trying to replace local newsrooms where they do have people assigned out to beats. We very much want to celebrate the local newsrooms that are already doing that and offer them new platforms and avenues to share that content. So I don't think that we would ever get to a point where we're trying to build out a more traditional newsroom model. But definitely I think, everything's on the table at this point in terms of how we scale our cities going forward.
And then looking forward a year or two into the future, what are your ambitions? What do you think you're going to be doing a year from now, 2 years from now that you're not doing today? You mentioned maybe a little bit more focus on events, maybe memberships. What's kind of on the drawing board, so to speak? Yeah,
so definitely we want to double down in audience engagement, both via the newsletter and podcast, and then in the real world. So we want to be out in the communities more. We want to be engaging with people more, sparking in-person dialogue. That is something that we are absolutely focused on. I think we're going to be doing some really cool things on the revenue side, trying out some really fun advertising options and other models of making money. That is the number one priority for us in 2023, now that we've built a pretty stable base of teams, is to figure out ways to really maximize the revenue of them. And we're already seeing some early successes there. And then honestly, just really more cool storytelling. We've started to do some more original reporting on our podcasts and newsletters, where we're working ahead, and we've put in practice some policies and just workflow tweaks to facilitate more of that in 2023. And so I really am hoping to see like some almost like mini feature series in each of our cities, where maybe a newsletter editor picks a topic that they're really interested in, and over the course of a few months really reports that out in a way that takes you from beginning to end on a given topic. I'd say those are the things. And obviously, we do plan to expand more in 2023. Again, we don't know exactly where or how many places we plan to expand to, but we will have more cities than we have right now by this time next year. That is for sure.
Do you think like all the written content will be contained within the newsletter? You see some stuff with like Axios, where even though they're dedicated to smart brevity, some of their longer stuff they're doing a truncated version in the newsletter and then a longer piece. Morning Brew's doing this a little bit too.
Yeah.
Do you see more like website only content?
I don't know about website only. Definitely we're moving to where we want a lot of our newsletter content to also live on the web, because it's just easier for long tail discovery of it. There could be, Q&As are a great example. We run Q&As in most of our cities in the newsletter. There are often things that they have to cut that they might, the audience might find useful, and we could do something where you could see the rest of the Q&A online. But as of now, it's less about like putting online exclusive stuff up there and more about just having a better way for people to access our back catalog of really interesting and fascinating stories that we've told over the almost 2 years that we've been doing this. So.
Okay, Brian, well, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
Awesome. CityCast or me personally? Because CityCast, we are always at citycast.fm, and then you can find our CityCast podcast in any podcast player you're looking for. And yeah, that's me personally. Trying to get off Twitter, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Bryan M. Vance on LinkedIn. And definitely check out our newsletters.
Bryan with a Y.
Yes, Bryan with a Y. Thank you. I always forget that there are other Bryans out there who spell it differently. That's my bias.
Well, Bryan, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Simon. I really appreciate it.